Good afternoon. My name is Donald Morrison. I'm a member of the Department of Philosophy and Classical Studies departments, and I direct the Rice University lecture series on ethics, politics, and society. The lecture series is co-sponsored for the second year now by the James Baker Institute, where we now are, and the Dean of Humanities. On behalf of everyone involved, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to each of you. A bit of introduction to the Baker Institute for those of you who might not be familiar with it. Many of you are. The Baker Institute is a strictly nonpartisan institute dedicated to the highest standards of intellectual excellence and integrity, with the goal of helping to bridge the gap between theory and practice of public policy by drawing together experts from academia, government, the media, business, and non-governmental organizations. The Honorable James A. Baker III, the 61st Secretary of State and 67th Secretary of Treasury, serves as the Institute's honorary chair. The Baker Institute's founding director, the Honorable Edward P. Dirigian, is a career diplomat and former American ambassador to Israel and Syria and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. As many of you who are regulars already know, the aim of this series is to offer members of Rice and the larger community a forum where first-rate scholars may seriously and carefully discuss important and often controversial moral, political, and social issues. Thank you for coming. No matter how distinguished our speakers are, ultimately the success of a series such as this depends on your interest and participation. Our speaker today, Roger Scruton, is an astonishingly accomplished philosopher, journalist, and public intellectual. Within academic philosophy, his most important contribution has been in aesthetics, above all, the aesthetics of music. Along with his novels, short stories, and a memoir, he's composed an opera. He's most widely known, I suppose, in his native Britain as a political activist and public intellectual. He was founder of the Conservative Philosophy Group, which helped change the climate of opinion in Britain in the 70s and 80s. It is a mysterious fact, anyway, I have no understanding or explanation of this fact, that at the highest levels of accomplishment in academic political philosophy, almost all academic political philosophers are some kind of liberal. Now, the word liberal covers a wide range of views, and philosophers use this word in a narrower sense than ordinary political usage. To explain that would take some time, which I won't take. But anyway, it does seem to be true that at the very highest levels of accomplishment, most political philosophers, in English anyway, are some kind of liberal. And that has been true of the majority of the speakers in the history of this series. I've long wanted to introduce a diversity of voices into this series, and I have done in a variety of ways. But let me tell you a story about the difficulty. Instead of explaining what I mean by liberal, let me tell you a story about the difficulty of this. About 10 years ago, I was at lunch with Amy Gutman, then Dean of the faculty at Princeton and afterwards President of the University of Pennsylvania. Her department, the politics department, had just hired a senior-level political philosopher. I said to her that this fellow was very smart and accomplished and a good hire. But, I said, he's a typical academic liberal, and Princeton was already full of these. On the principles of diversity of opinion advocated by John Stuart Mill, I said to Amy, what her department really needed to hire was a monarchist. To her credit, Amy Gutman granted my point. But, she complained, good monarchists are hard to find nowadays. Roger Scruton is a highly accomplished political philosopher and a thoughtful, qualified monarchist. This by itself makes him a world treasure. I am delighted to have been able to bring this subtle thinker, gifted writer, and world treasure to Rice.
I fear that after that introduction I can only be a disappointment, but it doesn't really matter because the topic is one about which one is almost bound to disappoint. It sounds so exciting, and of course, as you probably know from your own experience, the actual event is always ambivalent. And this is true of my lecture as well. I had intended it to be the thing that you'd take home as your best memory of the term. And as I thought about the subject, I realised that indeed there's only one way of saying the truth about sexual morality, and that is the way that turns people off. So you'll have to forgive me for that. But I think Don Morrison is absolutely right that in this sphere, at least, the philosophy and the political thought has been dominated by liberals in the American sense of liberal. Nobody actually knows quite what the American sense of liberal is because it's got so tied up with actual politics. But it's something, a liberal is something like this: the person who believes that old authorities, old interdictions, old forms of life have no real authority anymore, that the important thing is not just individual choice, but the individual choice of everyone, including those who previously have not exercised it. And therefore, that those conservative guardians of the old institutions like me should not actually be allowed into the positions where they can malignly influence the young. Now, I agree with them, and this was one of my rare sorties into the academic world, and I always come out in trepidation, knowing that I'm going to say something offensive, but I'm going to try, nevertheless, not to. I'm going to talk, as you know, about sexual morality. I want to just give you some philosophical ideas about sex from which a morality may or may not be constructed. I obviously don't want to legislate for you. And I'll talk for 45 minutes maximum, and then you can ask questions which may perhaps help me to understand exactly what your worries about the topic are. Now, in the world of my childhood, and believe it or not, I had one, the word immoral was used almost exclusively of sexual behaviour, and it denoted any conduct that deviated from the norm laid down by the long line of religious authorities then appealed to. No sex outside marriage, which was itself an exclusive partnership for life between two members of the opposite sex. And this norm that I absorbed in my childhood was not a passing fashion or a temporary phase of our civilization, because of course it has been endorsed down the ages, and not only in Christian countries, in pagan countries too, and of course famously defended by Plato in the Laws. Muslims have departed from the orthodoxy that we have our ancestors accepted by endorsing a plurality of wives, but not, notice, a plurality of husbands. But for them too, sex outside marriage has been strictly forbidden. And in general, if you look at over the history of this subject, you will see that sex has been regarded hitherto as a problem to be solved rather than a pleasure to be enjoyed. This is perhaps one of the great transformations that has happened in our time, that the idea of sex as a pleasure to be enjoyed has taken precedence over the idea of sex as a problem. And indeed there have been thinkers, the most notable recent one being Michel Foucault, who have seen the problematization, as he calls it, of sex as one of the essential and dispensable features of bourgeois civilization, and one from which we should move away. Now, Christianity is taken less seriously today than it was in my childhood. Islam, however, is taken more seriously, and as we have discovered, it has ways of making us take it seriously. And even if we have no personal reason to get a little bit clearer about questions of sexual morality than we have recently been, we have a strong political reason, stemming from the very evident fact that our lax customs, broadcast around the world, have incited the greatest indignation against us. In this talk, therefore, I shall bear in mind that whatever conclusions you may draw about the matters I'm going to touch on, the time has come for you to defend those conclusions and live up to the consequences of obeying them. In my view, it's no accident that sexual conduct is, and always has been, a matter of public scrutiny. And the old liberal idea that what I do with my private parts is of only private interest has been, I think, decisively refuted by our modern experience. In a nutshell, the private parts are the only parts in which the public takes an interest. So how do we begin to discuss this subject? Let us assume that we start from no religious belief. I mean, obviously, many of you in this audience have religious beliefs. I have religious beliefs. But nevertheless, it's not for a philosopher to assume those beliefs dogmatically. At the very best, they could be the conclusion of his argument, and certainly not the premise. So I'm assuming no religious belief. No one, as far as we know, has laid down the law about sex, other than we humans. The law, if it exists, is a man-made law, and therefore must be justified in terms that we humans can understand and endorse, regardless of our religious affiliation. So where do we begin in this territory? The point of departure for any sexual morality, it seems to me, including that of heathens, must be the question of sexual desire itself. What is sexual desire? Now, I have written a book on this topic, from which my career never recovered. But apart from me, modern philosophers tend to shy away from this question, and in the intellectual world in both Europe and America, a somewhat anxious but nevertheless liberal orthodoxy has become all but immovable. The liberal orthodoxy tells us that sexual desire is desire for sex. Who with, when, under what discipline is another question. Now, I take a very different view. I argue that sexual desire is desire for another person. And that is a very different thing, as I hope to make you see. Now, it wasn't always the case that philosophers avoided this question. Plato, as you may know, was extremely interested in it and wrote his most beautiful work, the Symposium, in response to this question, and also came back to it in the Laws when he legislated in a somewhat tetchy and bigoted way as to how we shouldn't really get involved in this stuff at all. But apart from Plato, philosophers haven't really explored it until the 20th century. And one reason for this, of course, has been the sheer embarrassment. It's difficult to talk about this topic in any way that doesn't sound either crude or facetious. Bernard Shaw said that it is impossible to defend decency without being indecent. What he meant was to give the real reasons why we should be decent. You have to describe those things which we are trying to hide by decency. And I think he has a point there. But still, let's have a go at it. Here are some points that a philosopher, I think, should put before the general public by way of introducing the topic of sex. First, the idea of the animal. We are animals, and given that we're starting from no religious belief, I think this is one of the premises that we can all in this room accept. We are animals physiologically and also in our fundamental biological needs. You don't have to take sides on the question of evolution and creationism and all that in order to accept this, that we are animals. And the evidence lies before us. We live and die as animals do. We are constructed as they are, and we have instincts which are parallel to theirs, including the reproductive urge. The reproductive urge is rooted in our animal nature. And our species depends, or hitherto has depended for its survival, on a non-negotiable reproductive demand, which manifests itself every so often in you and me as a fierce and barely to be resisted desire for another person. Now having said that, I would emphasize that that's only the beginning of the topic. It is true that we are animals, and it's true that our sexual feelings are rooted in our animal nature. But we are not only animals, nor are our sexual feelings really located in our animal nature, even if they're rooted there, any more than the plant is located in its roots. For we are also persons. And not all animals are persons, nor, come to think of it, are all persons animals. But that's another and rather more difficult question. Just to give you an indication of that question, obviously gods and angels, if they exist, are persons, but not animals. But you have a clearer example in the idea of the corporate person in law. Enron was such a person and behaved very badly and disappeared. But certainly was not an animal. Okay, how would we distinguish among animals those which are persons from those which are not? This is one of the big philosophical questions which many modern philosophers have touched on and helped us to understand. But not only modern philosophers have dealt with this. I think the greatest contributions were made by Kant and his immediate followers, Fichte, Hegel and Schopenhauer. And putting the matter very briefly, I would say the first thing that distinguishes persons from other animals is that persons are self-conscious. I don't mean that they're conscious only. I mean, dogs are conscious, except when they're unconscious. And so are cats and other higher animals. But they don't have the consciousness of self that we all have. By that I mean they're not able to identify themselves in the first person or relate to each other as we do when we describe what we're feeling and attribute that feeling to ourselves. Self-consciousness is a very complex and difficult to describe feature of the human condition, but it is part of what makes life so difficult for us. We aren't simply pursuing our own appetites and instincts in the way that a dog is. We're also standing back from ourselves in acts of judgment, wondering whether it is right for us to do so, whether it's right to act in this way, whether this instinct doesn't disgrace or demean me, and so on. So it's one of the features of a self-conscious being that he or she can feel shame, guilt, remorse, all those difficult emotions which someone like Foucault might wish to eliminate from the human condition, but which others, wiser than he, would regard as a fundamental part of our happiness when properly used and exploited. Going with self-consciousness is the idea of responsibility. We are responsible for our actions in a way that animals are not. Of course, you can train animals to be more useful to you, to do what you want, as you train dogs or horses and so on, and you can punish them for not doing what you want, or reward them for doing what you want. But that doesn't make them actually responsible for their actions in the way you are. They don't have to answer before a court of judgment. And even if there is no such court in reality, there will always be that court internally in your conscience. So through the very fact of responsibility, you find yourself committed to judging your own actions and expecting others to judge them too. Another way of putting this is to say that you're accountable for what you do and to some extent for what you are. And out of that accountability, of course, grows the whole complex artifact of morality, whereby we hold each other to certain rules and principles in order that our relations with each other can be based on coherent and consensual patterns. Now, because of these features of our condition as persons, interpersonal relations are very different from the relations that we witness in the animal world. We stand apart from the animal world in all kinds of ways through our emotional life and through our relations with each other. Animals can feel rage, like a bull can rage and charge in its rage, but they can't exactly feel anger. Anger requires the thought that you've been hurt or injured unjustly, and animals don't have that concept of injustice that we have. So that, for instance, when a herd of antelopes is attacked by a lion, those that get away don't want vengeance against the lion. They don't want to vindicate their fallen companion or anything like that. They just move off to the next pasture and carry on eating. Even in our appetites, you will see this difference between our self-conscious attitude to things and the merely conscious attitude that animals have. Consider eating. Now, eating is surrounded by prohibitions, customs, and conventions, which of course have been seriously eroded here in America in recent years, but nevertheless in civilized countries still exist. And the important thing is that human beings in their natural condition, natural civilized condition, will eat in company and in such a way as not to give offense to each other. In other words, so that they can carry on talking to each other, so that the mouth is not exclusively occupied in munching, so that the eyes can still meet the eyes of the companion, and so on. And this is a huge social achievement, and it's a way in which we, as it were, subdue that appetite to our interpersonal needs and our interpersonal relations. And indeed, if it weren't like that, it would be inconceivable that the first stage in courtship should be taking someone out to dinner. Anyway, that's a very simple example, but you can see how already in that example of a mere physical appetite, our existence as moral beings and self-conscious persons penetrates, as it were, our animal nature and transforms it into something higher, into a vehicle through which we relate to each other and explore each other, as it were, as individuals, as the courting couple in a restaurant might be doing. I would just digress here because one of the ways in which I managed to scrape a living is by writing a column as a wine critic for a leading left-wing newspaper in London. And I think one should always remember that one of the functions of wine is precisely that you can consume it while keeping your eyes on your companion. And as it passes into your body, the warming experience of it can be, as it were, related directly to the brief illusions that the company is worth it. And this sort of experience has actually isolated wine as a much more important part of our diet than anything else. You couldn't substitute it with milk for in those circumstances. Right. Well, another feature which I think is extremely important to point out is the idea of our personal existence as an individual existence. Individuality is a very complex and difficult concept, and one to which philosophers have devoted quite a lot of attention without, I think, getting any general agreement as to what it means. In a sense, this bottle is an individual. I say it's one bottle rather than two, and it's one coherent entity which endures through time. But, you could melt it down, break it up, and you wouldn't have made a great deal of difference to the fabric of the world. However, consider an animal or any organism like that which maintains itself in being. There, two halves of a bottle are two halves of a bottle and can be put together again to make a whole bottle. But two halves of a cat are not two halves of one single thing. They're two bits of something else, two bits of cat stuff, and you can't put it back together to make that single thing. Cats and dogs are more clearly individuals than inanimate things. Spinoza put the point by saying that they have a tendency to maintain themselves in being, conatus as he called it, and that this gives them a more real character as individuals than the merely inanimate things by which they're surrounded. But in the case of a person, there's something even more deeply rooted in the idea of individuality is even more deeply rooted. A person certainly is an individual animal, but he also has an individuality in the sense that he is one thing through his life and is accountable at any one moment for what he was at an earlier moment. He can be brought to book in the future for things that he did in the past. And his being an individual is something which matters to him and makes him unique in his own eyes and in the eyes of others. And it's because of this that we can actually treat human beings as having rights and duties and all the other things that we attribute to them in the court of law. We can think of them as owing things and accountable for things. It's because they are unique individuals that endure through time and can be identified correctly only by something like a proper name. And this enters very importantly into our sexual transactions. It seems clear to me at least that the normal case of sexual desire is the desire of one person for another as an individual. I mean, suppose your friend came running into your room one day and said, you know, I can't go on. I've got to have Elizabeth. And you said, don't be silly. Have Jane. She'll do just as well. You know, this is actually an insult both to, obviously, to the two girls in question and to your friend. That isn't the kind of emotion he's talking about. He's talking about an emotion that has targeted that individual as an individual. It's her that he wants. Whether rightly or wrongly is another matter. And this idea of our existence as an individual is connected and has been connected by people like philosophers like Kant and Hegel with the mystery of human freedom. It's the free being only that has this kind of individuality, the being who is through and through in his nature accountable for what he is. So I think we should start from the assumption, therefore, that sexual desire is an interpersonal reaction. It's something that one person feels towards another. It's not a desire for sex, abstractly considered, and indeed can exist in somebody who has no conception of what sex is, or that is the way to fulfill what he feels. I mean, that's more rare these days, but if you look back over the literature, and in particular if you look at the wonderful first erotic novel, Daphnis and Chloe, an ancient Greek novel, you will see exactly how this can be. Now, because of this interpersonal reaction, interpersonal nature of sex, the existence of the other as a subject of experience, as somebody who is himself a self-conscious being, has a great significance in our sexual stratagems. We don't regard the other person simply as a body on whom to relieve our need. That other person is there looking at us, and our courtship is the beginning of a complex negotiation, which one hopes will end in consent. But consent is only one small part of it. It's not just the yes. It's the yes from the whole being. What you want is that the other wants you in the same way as you want him. And all the intervening stages of shame, outrage, indignation, and so on are explicable on the understanding that what is wanted is the full involvement of that other individual as a self-conscious being, in an act in which you are reciprocally aroused. Now this is obviously very different from any appetite, like appetite for food, even if it were, if those appetites can have human beings as objects. Consider, for example, imagine that indeed there was no food except human beings, but that when they were eaten they didn't feel any pain, but were reconstituted painlessly after every bite. You know, obviously, you would there'd be strong rules of courtesy and decorum before you could actually approach your next meal, but the taking of it without the meal's consent wouldn't be the great offence that the taking of sex without the object's consent is. You know, you might say, sorry, I just had to, you know, and eventually, of course, people would realise that marriage is the solution there too, but still, it would be a marriage without the problems that we're used to as well. But nevertheless, the point about sex is that it's not on that level of appetite, even when it's only human beings that can satisfy it. Now, we are very used to, in philosophy, to the ruminations about the special status of persons. And one of the most famous philosophers to have conducted these ruminations is Kant, who reminds us that in all the transactions between each other, between persons that have significance for us, we have a choice between seeing those persons as means and seeing them as ends in themselves. If you like, seeing them as mere objects or things, and seeing them as subjects of consciousness who have a life of their own. And I think that you can already see that in the matter of sexual relations, that distinction is really important. Nothing is more offensive, especially to a woman, than to be seen as a mere object, a mere sex object, and to be treated as a means to the gratification of a desire of which she is not a constitutive part. And I think that you begin to see that, I think already, that by reflecting on the philosophy of the person, one can begin to make sense of some aspects, at least, of sexual morality, and why it is that sexual morality really does bite seriously, fiercely in this area of consent. Still, that's not all there is to sexual morality, and I want to say just talk about a few of the phenomena that need explaining. We've been... Sorry, before I do that, I'll say a little bit about some misconceptions. We have been seriously misled in recent years, and that is particularly so in this country, by false models of what sexual desire is. The most influential is that put about by the Kinsey reports, Alfred Kinsey and all his cronies, who represent the sexual desire, in the way I originally described it, as desire for sex, and sex as a matter of pleasurable sensations. And the only question is, only interest question is with whom and how and on how often and so on. And this picture of sex, of course, it is already, if you like, a demoralized picture. It's a picture which makes the personal nature of the object irrelevant to the desire. It's a mere accident if it happens to be a person on whom you inflict your desire for these sensations. And yet that image has permeated the culture and made it very difficult for people to think that once religion has gone, there is any further basis for sexual morality. And likewise, Freud's model of sexual desire as the working out of the libido through which attaches itself now to this object and now to that, which he builds it into his theory of the unconscious and with all its hydraulic imagery and so on. It makes it very charming, but nevertheless, again, it doesn't really engage with the fundamental phenomenon, which is the fact that which is sexual desire as an interpersonal reaction. So these false models, I've criticized them in my book on sexual desire, I think have caused us to believe that somehow sex, once liberated from religion, is a mere sensation about which nothing much can be said from the moral point of view, except that we shouldn't force it on anyone, and it should always happen by consent. But if that's all that there were to it, all kinds of phenomena would be without an explanation. Consider rape. If the only thing that was wrong about this was that it didn't have the consent of the victim, why is rape so much worse than, say, spitting on someone as you pass them by? That doesn't have her consent either. But as we all know, rape is something like a murder. The victim of rape has been not just abused and taken advantage of, but her being has in some sense been destroyed. She's been desecrated. And often victims of rape can't live with themselves thereafter as a result. How can you explain that? It can't be explained on this Kinseyite vision of what sex is and what the sexual desire wants. But it can be explained if you think of sex as somehow a deep existential commitment to another person, and something that has been stolen from you, the capacity to commit has been stolen from you in this act, and something in you, therefore, rendered neutral and forever wounded. So I think rape is a very good instance of the way in which we need a philosophy of the person in order to understand the phenomena of sexuality. Then there is courtesy and courtship. Now, these, as we all know, have been disappearing from the modern world, or at least getting ever more curtailed. You rush to, you say hi at the beginning of the party and rush to the conclusion at the end of it. And the disappearance of courtship has had huge and serious consequences, especially for young people. You might say, well, look, why do we waste all this time, these weeks and weeks in those ghastly restaurants and those awful films we have to take her to? Why don't we just curtail the process and get quickly to the point? Well, as you all know, one of the results of this curtailing of the process is that whole new crimes have come into existence, like this supposed crime of date rape. What that means is, of course, there is no such crime, but nevertheless, when a woman cries date rape, what she means is the whole thing went too quickly. I was not prepared, and so the consent is withdrawn, as it were, in retrospect. Now, whatever you think about the justice of that, I know this is extremely controversial, you must nevertheless recognise that this is a sign that courtship and that long process of preparation was not such an arbitrary thing after all. Maybe it was part of the whole procedure whereby one person prepares himself for union with another. And likewise in the charge of sexual harassment. This was never made in the past. It was called impoliteness if somebody put his hand on your knee prematurely, or if it was the wrong hand. But nowadays, of course, sexual harassment just means the sexual advances made by the unattractive, who are the majority. So there is, a huge injustice in this. But again, it's not. Again, it's very controversial. But the fact is that the reason why these changes have come about is because something which is absolutely necessary to human sexual relations has been treated as merely accidental, and that necessary thing is courtship. Then there is jealousy. This is one of the most difficult of all emotions to understand, and of course we have these wonderful works of art like Shakespeare's Othello, which have tried to introduce to us the extent to which jealousy is an existential catastrophe. And I think most people who've been through it realise that it is. But the important thing about jealousy is its focus. It's directed precisely at the individual who has betrayed you, or you think has betrayed you, and who is suddenly, whose very existence is like an offence to you. And the thought of the sexual act between that object, between your lover and your rival, becomes a kind of obsession, as it is, of course, in Othello. This very peculiar emotion, which can again be totally destructive of the person who feels it, couldn't possibly be explained in the language of Alfred Kinsey, nor, I think, in that of Freud. But again, it can be explained if we think of sexual desire as the creation of an existential bond between two persons, such that they are thereafter dependent on each other. And so on. I think you can think of other examples, and I think it's interesting to go through examples in the literature or in your own experience if you have it, and see exactly how it could fit into the idea of sex as a merely animal thing, and how it requires some understanding of the extent of your personal involvement in it. Now, none of the things that I've referred to, these consequences of the interpersonal nature of desire, have anything directly to do with reproduction or the need of the species, or the need to safeguard our offspring. Of course, at some level, sexual desire has everything to do with those things. But our personal life is not simply exhausted by the life of the species in us. We are not just means for the reproduction of our genes, even if certain popular scientists or scientific scientists want us to think that. We exist as individuals and as free beings who make choices for ourselves, and our lives are important at that level, regardless of the species. So that these phenomena I've been talking about concern the relation between lovers and exercise over that relation a system of constraints that seem to serve the function of shoring up and preserving the interpersonal nature of desire. That is surely the function of shame, and the function of all the conventions and hesitations and the courtesies that used to surround and limit the sexual act. Now, in conclusion, I just want to say 2 or 3 things about whether you could go on from here to draw up some kind of moral precepts for heathens in the modern world. Obviously, ethics is a whole branch of philosophy, and I'm not going to be able to give you a complete account of it in 5 minutes, but I think, nevertheless, there are 1 or 2 observations that could be made even at the level that we are at. First, I think morality and moral prohibitions generally can be looked at from 2 perspectives. They can be looked at from the perspective of society, the third-person social perspective, the perspective of the anthropologist who takes a system of rules and says, you know, this system of rules works well for those people. This is the kind of thing that they need in order to survive and reproduce themselves as a society. You know, and functionalist anthropologists, as they call themselves, are used to thinking in that way, and on the whole have had many true and useful things to say. But morality can also be looked at from the first-person point of view. You know, from my point of view, the point of view of practical reason. What reason have I to act in a certain way, given that, okay, these sexual prohibitions may be socially useful for society as a whole, but why is that a reason for me controlling my own life, giving up my pleasures simply in order to perpetuate the species, or perpetuate my social order? I know that's a famous problem in the philosophy of morals, to which I won't give an answer now, but just to remind you that there are these 2 quite different perspectives that people can take. And in the easy perspective is that of the functionalist anthropologist. He's the person who comes along and looks at a society and says, look, if they give up these moral prohibitions, there's going to be social breakdown. James Q. Wilson famously has done this exercise on American society and done all the sociological research and pointed out that, you know, once sexual promiscuity becomes established and people don't have fathers anymore and all the rest, then so society becomes dysfunctional. Now that might be true, might be false. I guess it probably is true because he's done all the research, but nevertheless it doesn't give me a first-person practical answer to the question what I should do. And I think in general a philosopher is under an obligation to be something a bit better than a sociologist. He's got to try and give you a reason, you here now, why you should limit your sexual conduct according to some pattern of prohibitions or moral laws. And I think the most likely way of achieving this is through the method advocated, or exemplified rather, by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, in which he tries to draw a general distinction between good and bad habits, and to construct an argument for saying that good habits, virtues as we call them, are constitutive of our happiness, whereas bad habits erode and destroy it. So he actually defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. And he tries to show in a very detailed way how by cultivating the virtues you make possible the kind of fulfillment of which we rational beings are capable. And without the virtues we lose that capacity to be fulfilled. So that the idea is to draw a distinction between good and bad good and bad sexual habits. Now, we hear a lot about the distinction between good and bad sex, but that, of course, is a libidinous and usually crude way of encouraging people simply to get at it again. and doesn't have anything to do with the distinction I want to draw between the virtuous habit, the habit which actually coheres with the project of human happiness, and the bad habit, the habit that erodes our capacity for happiness by focusing our sexual emotions in the wrong way. And I think here is where we can see what we might mean by perversion. When our sexual emotions are directed away from the responsible, mutually accountable union with another person, say towards the exploitation of children or towards bestiality or whatever, that is a paradigm case of what one should call perversion. It's a way of ensuring that your sexual life will never of itself lead to the kind of relations in which sexual fulfillment and mutuality can occur, and it also will adopt a repetitive pattern. That's the important thing about these perversions is, of course, that their objects are substitutable for each other. When the mature adult relation, the wanting of the other for the person that he or she is one which doesn't admit of substitutes. That is the thing, the relation on which fidelity and all that comes with it is founded. But when that aspect of mutual responsibility is taken away, then of course the object becomes substitutable, which is why you find that paedophiles are just endlessly pursuing new objects for their lust. And again, I think you can see here why one might regard pornography as one of the evils of modern society. Pornography makes us voyeurs of our own and other desire, and it refocuses desire from the person onto the object being the sexual organ. Of course, pornography is rampant in this country, and indeed protected as free speech under the Constitution, which is something I'm sure the Founding Fathers never intended. But nevertheless, I think most people feel that there is something wrong with a society in which that is the principal source of excitement among adolescents and also the lonely hearts. So there are two instances, perversion and pornography, of sexual evil in our society, which we can also see as inculcating bad habits that will prevent the person who's subject to them finding the sort of fulfillment which most of us in this room still believe it is our right and duty to pursue. And I think we should see virtuous desire as the opposite of those models. We should conceive it as the opposite of those models. Conceive it as a process in which each party brings the responsible self of the other into the foreground, bringing the other to the surface of his body so as to unite with him there. And that's why courtship and considerateness will always be a part of any serious morality. And that's why, of course, rape is such a devastation of its victim. And that point brings home what I've been trying to say to you, which is this. It is easy to trivialize sex, to describe it or misdescribe it as a kind of appetite and its satisfaction as a pleasant game. In fact, however, it is the most serious and compromising of all our choices, since it is not just pleasure that is at stake, but our integrity as persons. Sex has rightly, therefore, been perceived as dangerous, not just in its social consequences, but in its effect on the individual too. Now, our need for rules, guidance, and defences stems not from some arbitrary command or religious tradition, but from our very nature as rational beings. This is an area in which proceeding rightly we can find fulfillment, but proceeding wrongly we risk destruction. Now, people who say that can't expect any warm applause from a youthful audience. So by way of begging your indulgence, let me say that I was young once too.
Questions or comments? Justin?
Yes, when you
understanding that description is referring to romantic desire. For you, is there a distinction between romantic desire or sexual desire, or are they the same thing?
I think there are a lot of distinctions to be made here. But put it this way, there's a distinction between randiness and sexual desire. The condition of randiness is, of course, one in which you are prepared for this kind of relation with another, but it's not in itself a desire for anybody in particular, but it focuses as sexual desire eventually. And the question then arises, is it rightly focused or not? And that is the question that I think I want to put before you. I want to say that there always is that question. Is it right or wrong? If there weren't that question, then there wouldn't be a moral problem about prostitution, for instance, which there clearly is.
Gary? Gail? I'm sorry.
Would I assume then that you would consider masturbation a perversion, since it does not have those characteristics? It does appear to be something to satisfy a sexual desire without involving another person.
Well, the problem with masturbation is that it's underdescribed as such. It depends partly on the fantasies with which it is conducted. It might be. This is where Bernard Shaw's remark comes into effect. Suppose somebody long absent from his wife engages in masturbation, imagining making love to her, in the way that they always did together. Nobody would say that was a perversion. It's the same intentionality, but as it were, recreated in a void. But of course, it is true that masturbation can itself be a bad habit, one which replaces and neutralizes the capacity to go out and fulfill yourself in the right way. And it's intimately connected with pornography in this way.
Steve?
I understand your criticism of the Kinsey orientation toward this whole problem, in the sense that, as I think you put it in your book somewhere, it treats sex as by abstracting everything that belongs to the person. And that is to say, it ignores all the meaning that's involved, that comes with personhood. But I don't really see why you throw Freud into the same hopper, because it seems to me there that, apart from the details, but it seems to be there that the Freudian theory precisely does give an account of the transition to, or the relation between or the difference between an animal dimension and the dimension of fantasy or meaning or whatever you want to call it that belongs to the person. So they seem quite different.
Yeah, I agree with you. They're quite different. Of course, Freud is much more interesting for the reasons you say, that he is alert to the whole moral complexity of the phenomenon. But actually, the point I want to make is that his theory of desire, in terms of the flowing of the libido towards its attaching itself from one object to the next and so on, is a theory which also misrepresents the kind of thing that's going on in the actual process of desiring. I think that his theory might be right about what feeds in to your ultimate choice of partner. And he wants to say that those early relations with parents feed into your ultimate choice of partner in a way which is constitutive and not just an accident of your past. And there may be some truth in that. But I think he doesn't succeed in giving a theory as to what the commitment between you and the object of desire is.
I'm still curious about the Heathens, actually, and I'd like to just return to this idea that if sexual desire is an interpersonal desire rather than desire for sex itself, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the ways in which conceptions of personhood are themselves altered by contemporary customs surrounding human desire and eroticism.
I agree I was giving, obviously, a minimalist account of the person, just in terms of those features that philosophers would tend to agree do distinguish us from other animals. But these features are such that it's perfectly reasonable to conclude that the idea of a person is a historical idea. And I think that's what you're trying to imply, isn't it? That personhood is something which evolves in time and produces a different predicament at different periods in human history or different social contexts. And I think that is true. But what I would say, however, while that explains a lot of the variation in sexual customs between different peoples around the world, what explains the lack of variation, the extraordinary lack of variation when it's all things considered, is that there is this common core to personhood, which is that of mutual accountability and self-consciousness, and the things that I was referring to.
I'm somewhat confused about the presentation. Am I to understand that you think that given a philosophical argument about the nature of the person, you can arrive at some conclusion which is tantamount to traditional Christian sexual morality? Because it seems to me that the attempt to ground sexual morality in apart from revelation and mystical experience of God, therefore discursively, rationally, philosophically, is exactly what has led to the evils you talk about: perversion, fornication, pornography, etc. So is that your contention? Because I think history has shown the attempt to ground a traditional sexual morality in reason has led to our current postmodern situation where there are no mores other than don't rape someone.
Well, this is I feel certain sympathy for what you're saying. The problem as I see it is this, that it could very well be that if I worked really hard on this, and I once did, I could find abstract philosophical arguments which do uphold something like, say, the old Christian morality of sexual union. But that would be my achievement, and it won't help Joe Higgins in his trailer park in Oregon, whereas his local pastor will. And the mass of mankind is never going to be brought to the moral light by philosophy. But it could, nevertheless, philosophy, one of the things that philosophy can do is give the real reasons for those noble lies, as Plato called them, that the priests are telling the people. And I think this is what Thomas Aquinas managed to do in his work, in the Summa Theologica, was to give deep philosophical arguments for views that could be simply stated and simply understood in another way by ordinary people in the context of religious belief. But I agree with you, as soon as people think that therefore it's human reason that we've got to look for our authority rather than revelation, then we're on a slippery slope, because most people don't have the use of reason that they require.
I have a question about AIDS. I do appreciate the effort to keep notions of perversion and eros, love if you want, the interpersonal, keep those concepts afloat and not bring them always down to the base level of sexuality. I think it's a very healthy philosophical exercise to do that, but it seems so focused on one-on-one relationships and how those may unfold in the proper moral framework. What do you do with a mass phenomenon, an unprecedented sexual phenomenon that really seems to defy moral explanation, except for the fact that I would agree it's probably not a punishment from God?
Well, I haven't said that, but no, I mean, there's nothing that a philosopher can do as by way of a contribution to the AIDS problem. All that, there are two responses broadly to the AIDS problem. There's the liberal response, which is go on doing it but safely, and there's the conservative response, which is don't. Roughly, I mean, there's lots of variations around the edges of those, but the question then for me would be, from my argument, is it a liberal morality that's likely to emerge, or a more traditional morality that's likely to emerge? And I haven't tried to draw any explicit moral conclusions, though of course I am pointing in the direction of preserving as much of the traditional respect for the one-on-one encounter as can be coherently managed in modern circumstances. And I don't think that mankind has any other hope when confronting AIDS than that. I think everything else is only a temporary illusion, really.
Well, I had a quick question, I guess, about the limiting cases of your of what you've argued. So, like, as you lay down on your down pillow at night, your mind tends to wander, and if it wanders onto some form of impure thoughts, is that what is wrong? Like, I can understand where you argue that pornography in its certain senses is wrong, but what if, you begin to think of that independently of I guess it goes back to your concept of randiness. Is the randiness itself wrong, or is it the action upon thereof?
Yeah, this is a very good point. And what I would say is, as I began by saying, sexual desire is rooted in our animal life. And that animal life makes itself known to us in all sorts of ways other than through our rational choices. And it would be absurd to say that we must somehow repress all those parts of the animal life that are going to go on boiling away in us, especially at the age of raging hormones. What matters from the moral point of view is whether or not you acquire good habits or bad habits. That's what I'm trying to say. The good habit is one that enables you to focus all that need in a genuine sexual desire for another, one which commits you and also brings about that kind of eliciting from the other of the same sort of commitment. And that, I think you can work out for yourself what would be good habits and what would be bad habits from this point of view. The mere passing through your mind of libidinous thoughts is no different from wet dreams and all the rest that people are liable to, but from the very reason that this is a deep animal need that we're talking about as well.
I have a couple of questions. I guess, well, one is that given that sexual desire in the sense that you don't like, desire for sex clearly exists, and we can choose to call it independence if we want to. And likewise, sexual desire in the sense that you do like also exists. Plenty of us have desires for specific individuals, for their individuality with all the attendant stuff. Then, is part of your claim that we should sort of work to elevate the sexual desire in the interpersonal sense because that, in the Aristotelian sense, that sort of contributes more to our happiness, our well-being, our flourishing? I mean, do we have, the justification for preferring the interpersonal one to the sort of, the more sort of, object-tidal one, is that it, as a matter of contingent empirical fact, given the kinds of beings we are, it makes it's more likely to be part of a happy life. I mean, is that? I guess that's the first. Is that?
Yes, I would certainly say that I wouldn't say it's a matter of contingent fact, although what I was saying at the end was that insofar as I envisage an argument that will give me a reason, rather than sociological argument, something that would give me a reason to amend my sexual ways, it would be an argument of the kind that Aristotle puts before us, for saying that, for instance, that justice is a part of friendship and friendship is a part of happiness, that sort of thing. And that's an a priori argument that he gives, and I would say the same about fulfilled sexual desire, that it is a part of happiness.
But it's an a priori.
Yeah.
So
all the I can't see any empirical arguments other than the obvious one that seems that people do seem to be happier in that when they live that way.
But you would then be committed to saying in a particular case that the person who was training themselves to go for the interpersonal stuff and not give in to their objectival desires, who claim to be utterly miserable, but you'd be committed to saying, in some sense, despite what they believe about themselves, they are in fact happier. I mean,
well, look at it this way. Fate can always deal a rotten blow, and by inculcating in yourself the virtues, you might expose yourself to dangers and horrors that the vicious person by nature avoids. And this is very obvious with the virtue of courage. The courageous man is precisely that one who's going to get it when the battle begins. But Aristotelian would say, and I would agree with him, that when thinking about your life as it should be, you cannot take account of those things which are not presently foreseeable. You cannot take account of the fact that when you fell in love with that woman, she turned out to be the wrong woman.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about the case of somebody who's miserable because of unrequited love, or I'm just talking about somebody who judges, who in fact, from the external point of view, has a very good relationship, but if you ask them, says, well, I'm only doing this because I went to this lecture by Roger Scruton, and before that, I thought when I become an atheist, I was free of this. He came along, persuaded me that being an atheist was absolutely no defense against this kind of stuff. And so I gave up my other lifestyle, and I mean, I love her, she loves me, everything seems to be fine, but damn it, I'd be a lot happier if I was, doing, roughing with everything that I could find. And it's not, I mean, I'm talking about somebody who really, sincerely from the internal perspective, judges that, I mean, maybe I was misleading when I said they were miserable, but judges they would have been a lot happier, and they've had experience of both kinds. So it's just when you said it was an a priori argument, it suggested to me that you'd be committed to saying something like, well, no, the fact is they are happier. They just they're confusing sort of happiness with desire satisfaction or something like that. So you're committed to a view of happiness
Yeah, the argument that I've given obviously I've only given 45 minutes worth of indication of where one would go, but the argument would have to be made good by developing a full concept of happiness, which would show that indeed this person was more happy than he thought, that I don't have any problems with that kind of happiness, that kind of concept of happiness.
Well, neither do I, although I'm not sure I might have a problem with this case, but anyway, in general. Please.
You alluded to Plato's symposium, and Plato certainly seems to imply that our sexual choices have a bearing on our ability to be educated. I recently read Tom Wolfe's I Am Charlotte Simmons. He seems to think that contemporary sexual choices have a tremendous impact on the ability to be educated in the contemporary university. And I wondered whether you saw any connection there.
Yes, I mean, Plato's connection between eros and education is a very persuasive one, in a way. That the relation of teacher to student has something in common with the erotic, always, inevitably, because you're imparting something into that person. And likewise, that person is sort of admiring you for the powers that you have to do that. Well, I regret to say I haven't read Tom Wolfe's novel yet, but I know the sort of thing he's saying. But in Plato's case, of course, this was intimately connected with his own homosexuality. I mean, he felt that the homosexual love could be vindicated in the same by showing that it was a planting of seeds in just the way that heterosexual love is, but a planting of rather more interesting, because spiritual seeds. So he wanted to take the analogy really, really seriously. But he also, of course, famously defends, both in the Symposium and the Laws, the view that while homosexual love is in this way somehow higher than heterosexual love, it should never demean itself through the actual sexual act. It must always be sublimated, or must aim to sublimate itself into a kind of spiritual contemplation. So that's a very, very complex response of a highly neurotic and highly intelligent person to a difficult situation.
George? This is a question that goes back to near the beginning. At the beginning, you distinguished two ways of thinking about sexual desire, where one of them is a desire for sex, and the other is a desire for a person. And then, in the course of the discussion, there in defense of the second interpretation, you pointed out a number of sort of phenomena in our lives that the second interpretation of sexual desire does a good job of explaining. And one of them was jealousy. And you rightly noted that if you just understand sexual desire as a desire for sex, then how crazy people get with jealousy is hard to make sense of. It's a big mystery. And the suggestion was, although this was never developed too much, that if we think of sexual desire as a desire for another person, well, then it all falls into place why we get so jealous when those whom we desire get involved with other people. And when I was thinking about that, and it seems to me that even if we understand sexual desire as a desire for another person, it's still a bit mysterious why we get so crazy with jealousy. Obviously, I think obviously the explanation is going to be that when you unfold the idea of desire for another person, that exclusivity comes into it in some essential way. But it's been a while since I read your book, so I don't remember how it comes in. So my question was exactly how does the explanation work here, and if it does turn on some essential exclusive element in the desire for another person, how does that work? It's been a while since I read that book as well, and I was aware, as I said that today, that this isn't adequate, what I'm saying. So this is you've pinpointed a place where further argument is needed, and where I would now wish to go, I think, is by thinking more clearly about the role of the body in desire, and the way in which jealousy refocuses your desire for your beloved on the sexual act and the sexual organs and all that, and the kind of desecration that involves of an image which you had to keep unified, the unification of the person, the body, how it is fragmented now. And I've written a lot more along those lines in my book on Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, which had just come out.
And there I try and take seriously these elemental feelings of sacrilege and desecration, which do seem to be always lurking in the wings of sexual love. So I think I'll give a different kind of explanation now.
If I might try to interject myself with a question, I'd like to ask about your views of an analogy and suggest a way in which the analogy go in a different direction, how you'd respond. And that is the analogy to friendship. Sexual relation, as you have described it, and friendship have in common the mutual recognition of two persons and affection for the other person as such, at least in some kinds of friendship. And so then it seems to me an interesting question, what's the essential difference of the sexual friendship or the sexual version of this mutual relation? But drawing upon theory of friendship, there are all kinds of different sorts of friends. There are casual friends, there are football buddies, there are business friends. There's maybe a highest kind of friendship when, on Aristotle's view, one virtuous person recognizes the virtue of another and appreciates that person's company for that reason, and so on. Now, the theory of friendship might suggest that while there's a highest kind of friendship, lesser kinds of friendship can be good. And making an analogy from that to the sexual relation, one might suppose there's a highest kind of sexual relation, which might be a lifetime commitment to one other person, mutual dependency, and so on. But there might be lesser kinds of sexual relation of a more casual sort. There might even be, Aristotle talks of business friends, there might even be the business sexual relation. One regularly visits, and that's higher than... So, I mean, how would you cut off that analogy, or would you want to, and how would you do it?
Well, I think it's a very important analogy, partly because it doesn't really work. C.S. Lewis, in The Four Loves, makes an interesting remark. It said that friends are side by side, lovers face to face. What he means by that is, of course, that friendship is essentially a cooperation between two people who fully understand what they're doing, and is and doesn't require the immediate presence of the other. Whereas the physical side of sexual relations is of the essence, the actual physical contact, and the fact that you are lost in that other. And of course, there are different degrees of involvement in sexual relations, as in friendship. And of course, indeed, there are higher forms of sexual relation, and just as there are higher forms of friendship. But about friendship, one doesn't want to say that any of the forms of friendship are wrong as such, but there are certainly forms of sexual relation that anybody will say are wrong. Anybody in this room will have something to say about bestiality, paedophilia, and so on, and you can build up your examples in a way which will make people realize that what's going on in the sexual act requires a completely different conception of what is at stake than what is going on in friendship. This is why there can be unrequited sexual passion, but not unrequited friendship. Friendship is mutual, or it doesn't, or not at all. And you're a victim of your sexual passion. You're not a victim of your friendship. And a lot of distinctions like that, which make it, to me, anyway, put friendship in a different moral sphere from sexual desire.
Yes.
If I understand it correctly, if we said virtues are the good of the person, and interpersonal desire is a healthy sexual relationship. and that's what's to be strived for, then it would follow then, it appears to me at least, that then you would say jealousy is a virtue.
The capacity, that's a good point, the capacity for jealousy might be part of sexual virtue, indeed. Just as the capacity for shame is. There are a lot of bad feelings that we don't want, but the capacity for which comes with developing in the right way. Shame is a better example, because we all know that the shameless person is the person whom we regard as beyond the moral pale. It's the capacity to feel this really rather bad emotion, which comes with all the good things that make him capable of being what he is. And likewise, you're absolutely right with jealousy. There's a very good way of freeing your life of jealousy, which is to get rid of love. And a lot of sort of modern vices you can see under the general description of the avoidance of love. Pornography has this as a prevailing characteristic, doesn't it? It's there to prevent you thinking that this thing going on has any other significance than the physical act. And by avoiding these higher feelings, you can also avoid the cost of them. And jealousy is one of the costs. But it doesn't follow that you should avoid them. Rather, you should conduct your life, if you can, so that jealousy is something you never have to suffer.
Perhaps a final question?
You said that sexual mores against promiscuity wasn't a passing fancy, but haven't people always behaved badly and just pretended otherwise?
Well, yes. I agree with that. Rochefoucauld says, famously, that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And of course, in modern society, people regard hypocrisy as the greatest vice. As long as you're not a hypocrite, they say, you're doing all right. Which means that virtue gets no tributes at all. Because we all have to be hypocritical about this matter, and it's one of the things that proves that hypocrisy is itself a virtue, in my view. We have to, because after all, our predicament is that of on one hand, of rational beings pursuing the highest ideals, but tied, as Yeats says, to a dying animal, which has its own views as to what should be done. But I think, at a time when people actually paid these tributes to sexual virtue, it didn't mean that they didn't recognise that there really was such a thing, nor did it mean they didn't strive to embody it in themselves. I think one of the important differences between those times of the great hypocrites and now is that the hypocrites still believed in passion. That the things that they hid, nevertheless, were things that were exemplify precisely the kind of sexual relations that I've been defending. It's just you couldn't go public with them because they were outside marriage. But when the result of the anything goes liberal morality is that passion disappears, and so there isn't anything to hide.
Well, passion may be disappearing in some places, but passion for the life of the mind remains strong.